Morning everybody. The talk this morning is about Solr Facets and Alfresco 4. So I've just got a slide to introduce myself. I'm a senior engineer at Facets. I've been working for them for 2.5 years, and that's the same time that I've been working with Alfresco and Solr. I'm also an Alfresco certified engineer and I have a Solr certification. And this year I won the Dashlet challenge with my search term Dashlet, which I'll be showing you later as well. So the agenda for this morning is I'm going to show you the demonstration of Solr Facets in Alfresco, and then I'm going to follow that with an overview of Facets in Solr. So I'm going to remove the Alfresco from the equation for a moment, and we'll just give you a quick start guide to Facets. Then I'm going to walk through my implementation of Solr Facets in Alfresco and show you the search flow of execution and some of the main extension points, and give you some examples of code, and so you can see how I've got everything working. And then finally I'll just finish off with plans for the module, because there are plans to release this module. So I'll start with the demonstration, and I've got this running on Alfresco Enterprise 4.0.2.9. Now before I show you the facets, I just want to show you why we need facets and why they're useful. So if I do a search in the repository at the moment, the search results are returned and we have all of the results on one page. So if I wanted to find all of the PDF documents, I would need to scroll down and look at all of the documents to try and find them. I can also go back to the advanced search page and add a filter to filter down the results, so I only get PDF documents in the results. But then I might want to only return documents that have Berlin as a title, so I'd need to go back to the advanced search page, enter Berlin, and do another search. And again, it's filtered down the results, but it's not as dynamic as it could be, and you really need to know what you're searching for up front. So it's not as intuitive as Facets. So Facets allow you to add filters post-search, so you don't need to know what you're searching for up front. You can just guide you through navigation. So I'll just go to the Facet Manager. Now this is something I've created in the admin console. So it's only available to admins, and it allows you to add facet fields to Alfresco. So I'm going to add a couple of facet fields now so you can see how it works. So at the top here we've got the content type. So there are 4 different facet types you can choose from. You can select, a facet type, so you can select a content type, a MIME type, a property, or a date. So content type, properties, and date can both be out of the box and custom. So I'm going to select a property. Now when I select that, that's done a call to Alfresco to find all of the suitable candidates for facets that are properties. So that means they've been indexed in a particular way, and I'll talk more about that later. But I'm going to select the title here, and I'll enter a display name. So I'm going to set it as location, because all of my title fields have a location, just for the demonstration purposes. So I'm going to set a min count to 1, which basically tells Solr to only return facets that have a constraint that is equal or greater to the min count. And I'm going to set a limit to 20, which tells Solr that you only want to return 20 constraints for a particular facet. I'm going to add this facet to the Ixis site search and then save it, and then it will update the Facet Manager with my new facet. I'm also going to add a date facet so you can see how that works. And it's gone to the Alfresco repository and returned all of the date fields. So I'm going to select created date. And as you can see, we've got some additional parameters here at the bottom. So we've got a start date, an end date, and a gap. So I'm going to set the start date to the beginning of the year. And the end date to today's date. The gap I'm going to set as a month. So there's 3 choices. You can choose day, month, or year. And I'll select 2 months as the gap. I'll just enter a display name and a limit of 20. And I'll also add that to the Facet-search. So as you can see, we now have 4 facet fields in the Alfresco repository. The Facet Manager also allows you to edit and delete facets. So I'm going to edit some of the facets I added earlier. So I'm going to edit the content type by adding that to the Facet-search. And I'm also going to edit the MIME type facet by adding that to the Facet-search as well. So now when we do a search, we now see facet fields along with the search results. Sorry, I need to go to the exercise. Try again. And as you can see, it's added the facets that we added via the Facet Manager. So we have a MIME type facet, a content facet, a location facet, which is title, and a created date facet. So now if I want to filter down the results, I can select these constraints that are underneath each facet name. So if I wanted to choose the PDF documents, it will now filter down the results, so there's only 13 results. I can also choose Berlin as a location. As you can see, now we now have 6 results, so it's filtered them down again. And if I want to find documents that were created in September and October, I can choose a created date facet, and that will filter them down even further. So we can filter them back out by selecting the grey box next to the facet constraint, and then you can just filter your facets back out again. And we have the original results here. So we have 42 results. Now if I go back to the Facet Manager, I'm going to just make some modifications so you can see how easy it is to configure the facets. So for the content type facet, I'm going to remove it from the Facet-search and add it to the repository search and save that. For the created date facet, I'm going to add that to the repository search and also change the date gap to a month rather than 2 months. And save. For the MIME type facet, I'm going to set the limit to 3. So it will only return 3 constraints for MIME types. And for the title facet, I'm going to set the minimum count to 10. So that will only return constraints that are greater to or equal to 10. And I'll also add that to the repository search. So now if we do a site search, you'll see that those changes that we made via the Facet Manager are now displayed here. So MIME type has only got 3 constraints returned for it. The location has only got constraints that have a count that is greater than or equal to 10. And the created date now has a gap of a month rather than 2 months. So if I was to do a search on all sites, we don't have any facets displayed because I haven't actually added any facet fields to that search scope. But if I search on the repository, we get the facets because I added 3 different facet fields to the repository. So that's the functionality of facets. Now I'd like to show you my search terms Dashlet because that also uses facets. And you can see it down here in the bottom left-hand corner, bottom right-hand corner. So at the top we've got a number of, well, basically what this does is it displays all of the search terms that have been executed on the repository. And there's a number of filters along the top that allow you to filter down those search terms to only display certain terms. So we've got a site or a search scope filter that allows you to select where the search was executed. So if I did an all-site search, you can see, I don't know if there's any difference. So if I do a Facet search, yeah, we've only got 1 search term that was executed on the Facet search. You can select when the facet was searched for. You can control how many search terms are returned and displayed, and you can also select a filter that will only show your search terms. So if we select that, it filters down the search terms. There's also an additional toolbar here to only show search terms that return 0 results, so that could be useful for auditing purposes. And there's another filter to display the counts, and these are actually facets. So, yeah, it's logarithmic, and the display search count displays all the counts, so that's how many times it's been executed in the repository. And these are facets, so what I do is I do a search for the search terms and do a query for the facets, and what's returned I display here. So that's just another way I've used facets in Alfresco 4. So now we have an understanding of the functionality. I just want to talk about Solr facets. So I'm going to remove them from Alfresco for a moment and just give you an overview of how they work. So there are 3 different flavors of facets. There are field facets, and they're things like the description field, MIME type, and content. There's also date facets, and obviously they're things like created date and modified date. And there's also number range facets, and a good candidate for number range facets would be age. And I haven't implemented the number range facets in my solution. To use a facet to use a field for faceting, you need to index it in a particular way. So it needs to be indexed, not tokenized, and the reason for this is because Solr uses the index version for display purposes. So we don't want to split it on white space or lowercase it. And that leads us to the third point, which is not stored. So usually, if you want to display a field, you need to store it. But for faceting, it's the other way round. You don't want to store that field. Now, so for people who are not familiar with Solr, when you do a request, it sends a HTTP GET request to Solr, and you can apply parameters to that request to tell Solr what you want to return. So invariably, there's a query parameter, which will be q equals the field and your search term, but you can also apply additional parameters to tell Solr to return some facets. And here's an example of some facet field parameters. So the first one is facet enabled, and you usually set this to true to tell Solr to enable faceting. Facet field is the field that you want to do the faceting on, and that should have adhered to the best practices that I showed you in the previous slide. Facet min count is what I showed you in the demo. So if you set a min count to 5, it will only return constraints that have a count that is greater than or equal to 5. And facet limit just tells Solr how many constraints you'd like to return for a facet field. And here's an example of a Solr request with those facet parameters. So date facets have slightly different parameters. So instead of facet field, you would specify facet date. And they also have a start, an end, and a gap, as you saw in the demo. It's probably worth noting here that date facets don't have a min count. So if you had a range of a year and you had a gap of a month, if there was, if February and January or May returned, had a count of 0, it would still return that constraint. So you can't add a min count to date facets. And here's an example of Solr request URL that has date facet parameters. So now I'm going to talk about my implementation in Alfresco. So before I did any development work, I analysed the Solr and Alfresco integration code to try to get an understanding of what needed to be done. And during that analysis, I noticed that there was a partial implementation of faceting in Alfresco already. So out of the box, if you were to look at the source at the moment, you'll see that there's a facet field pojo, which contains all of the information you need for facets, all of the properties for a facet field. It has logic to add facet field parameters to the Solr request URL. And there's also a mapping object that will map facet results to a JSON object in Java. and it will map so that it will map the search results and the facet results. So this was a good starting point. So with this implementation in mind, I tried to break down the tasks that I needed to do to get Facet working. And I came up with 5 main tasks. So I needed a way of adding facets to Alfresco, and you saw this in the demo, so I used the Facet Manager to do that. And once we have facets in Alfresco, I needed a way of getting those facet parameters or the facet properties into the search request. Once the results come back, I needed a way of getting the facet results up through the search flow of execution and back over to share. And also, finally, I needed a way of adding support for filter queries. Because if you don't have filter queries, it's pointless having facets because you can't filter down the results. So they're the five main tasks that I identified, and I'm going to walk through all of these tasks and show you kind of how I got it all working. So the first task in that list is to add facet fields to Alfresco, and I showed you in the demo I used the Facet Manager, which is a tool in the admin console. And this is very similar to the Tag Manager. So anyone who's used the Tag Manager will see that it's very similar, and it carries out the same function. So I based my solution on the current Tag Manager, and it allows admin users to execute all of the CRUD operations. And in order for them to do that, I created a REST API in Alfresco with all the necessary web scripts. So get, post, delete, and put. I also created a custom content model and a custom type with facet field that would define all of the properties I needed for the facets. So I was able to store a facet field in the Alfresco database. So in addition to that, the Facet Manager also lets you specify what facets to display. So as you saw in the demo, you have content type, MIME type, property, and date. You can also choose how you want the facets to be displayed. So you can set the display name, the minimum count, and the limit. And you also can specify when you want the facets to be displayed. So in Alfresco, when you do a search, there's something what I call a search scope. So you can search on an individual site, and all of the sites, or the repository. And this is mirrored in the Facet Manager, so you can select if you want a facet to be displayed for the development site, but not the HR site, or a repository search, and not an individual search. So it's very configurable in that way, so it gives you a lot of control how you want the facets displayed. Now, before I move on to the second task in my list, I'd just like to talk about indexing again, and this time talk about how you can achieve those best practices in Alfresco. So here's an example of how you can do it. So we have a field name location, and I've set index enabled equals true, stored equals false, and tokenized equals both. Now, if you set tokenized to both, it will create a tokenized version of the field in your index and an untokenized version. And the untokenized version is the field that I'm interested in for faceting. So if I was to have a value for location that was New York and Alfresco indexed that, it would generate 5 different variations of that field in the index. And here they are. So the one we're interested in for faceting is the 4th one in this list. And it has the naming convention of a @ symbol, fully qualified name, plus that dot underscore underscore dot u. And I know you could assume that means unindexed. So this tells us that we need to use this field for when we set the facet field, or we add the facet field parameter to the Solr request URL, we need to use this naming convention, or this convention, to make sure that when the facets are returned, it uses this as-is version of our field in the index, so we get sensible results. I'd also like to talk about the search flow of execution. Now, out of the box, this is kind of how it works. So a user does a search in Alfresco. It sends the search parameters to the search web script, which has a controller called search lib.js. And in search lib.js, it processes all of those parameters and adds them to a query definition object in JavaScript. That query definition object is passed to search Java, and in search Java, it extracts all of the parameters from that query definition object and creates a search parameters object and populates all of the values that were passed across in the request into that search parameters object. A call to the search service is executed, and because we're using the Solr search subsystem, it passes those parameters to Solr query HTTP client. And this is the class that prepares the query before it sends it to Solr. So it's where it generates the Solr request URL. And in this class is that out-of-the-box block of code that will add facet fields to the Solr request URL. But because there's no way of adding facet fields to Alfresco at the moment, it's just skipped, so it's ignored. As you can see, there's a field facet pojo here, and that's also not used. So it sends the request to Solr. The results are returned, and they're passed to Solr JSON results set. And all of the results are mapped to a JSON object in Java that's passed back up to the search Java class. And a set of script node objects is created from the results and passed back up to the search lib.js. And in the search lib.js, it processes those results and creates a results list that's passed to the free marker template to generate the JSON response that's returned back to share. And then you get the search results on the search results page. So that's the out-of-the-box search flow of execution. So when I was implementing my solution, I didn't want to deviate from this too much. So as you can see, this is the implementation with facets enabled. So we have the same flow of execution that goes through to the REST API and down to the Java API. It comes into the search Java, and then I do a call to something called a facet service, which queries the database and retrieves all of the facet fields that have been added via the facet manager. Then it generates a list of field facet objects and passes them back up over to the search Java class, and then they're added to the search parameters object. So when it passes that search parameters object to Solr query HTTP client, that block of code that's out of the box to add the facet field parameters to the Solr request URL is now executed. And all of the facet field parameters are added to the URL, and then the search is sent over to Solr. The results are returned, and the results are passed to Solr JSON results set. And where it maps the search results, it also maps the facet results. And that JSON object is passed back up to search Java. And where it's set, it creates a set of script nodes objects. I also add something called a script facet. So I generate a list. I add from those results, I generate script facet objects and add them to the same set. And they're passed back up to the search lib.js. And when those results are processed, it creates a results list, but also a facet results list. And that's passed to the back to the free marker template, and it will generate a JSON response that contains the original search results plus the facet results. And that's returned back to share. And in share, there's a YUI class called search Java, and I check to see if there's any facets available, and if there are, I dynamically create the column on the left-hand side of the search results page to display the facets. So that's kind of an overview of how it works. So I'm just going to show you some code examples. So when the request goes over to the search web script, it processes the parameters and it creates this query definition object. And that has all of the original parameters in blue, apart from filter queries. But there's also two additional parameters that I add to it, which is the search scope that helps us identify where this search is being executed, and the site ID. So if there's a site ID, we need to know that as well. It's also worth noting that the filter queries here is something I've added too. So the filter queries follows the same flow of execution as the facets. So this query definition object is then passed to the search Java class with this call at the bottom here. So search query def. And when it comes into the search Java class, it extracts the search scope and the site ID from that query definition object. And if there's a search scope isn't null, then it will call the facet service to get a list of the facet field objects that are applicable to this search. And then they are set in the search parameters object, which is then passed to the search service. So that passes that to the Solr query HTTP client, and this is the block of code that will add facet parameters to the Solr request URL. I've summarized it for the presentation, but if you look in the code base, it's quite a big, long block of code. But these are the main parameters that I'm concerned with today. So we've got the facet field, the min count, and the limit. And the facet field will be set, and it will use that naming convention that I mentioned earlier. So we can ensure that it's going to do the facet query on a field that's been indexed correctly. So the facet field will be set like this. So we'll have the @ symbol, the fully qualified name, and the suffix at the end that indicates that it's an untokenized field. So once the search has gone over to Solr, I need to return the facet results back up through the search flow of execution and back to share. And I did this in the search Java class. So when a list of set objects are created with script node objects, I've added a block of code to check to see if there's any facets also, and if there are, I create something called a script facet object. Now, a script facet object implements the same interface as the script node object, so I'm able to add them to the same set, and they contain all of the information that is required for a facet field. So all of the information that the free marker template needs to generate the response that's sent back to share. This is where I also do a lot of processing for the dates, so where I format the dates. I also construct the filter queries. So when the filter query, we've got all the information we need for a filter query here, so I generate it here and send it back to share. It's also worth noting I've got a Boolean flag just to indicate whether it's a facet field or not. And this is useful in search lib.js. So when we have all of the result nodes, we can check to see if it's a facet. And if it's a facet, I add it to the facet results object. And if it's not a facet, it's just processed in the usual way. So as you can see, we now have two items. So we have the original search result items and the facet items, and they're passed to the free marker template. And in the free marker template, it generates the JSON response that's sent back to share. So as you can see at the top, you've got the out-of-the-box items. So they're just the search results, but underneath that, you've got the facet results as well. So we've got the display name, which is location, and a list of the constraints. And each constraint has the constraint label, so that's the name and the count, and also the filter query. So the filter query has that same naming convention, so it has the @ symbol, the fully qualified name, and the untokenized suffix at the end, and also the search term. So that's sent back to share, and I needed a way to add those facet results to the results page, search results page, and share dynamically. So out of the box, the search results page has the div, the body div, and the results div. So I'm adding this results container and adding the facets div and the results div to that container. And I do that in search.js, which is a YUI class. So if there are facets, I create the results container on the fly and the facets div on the fly. Then I've got a call to generate the facets, so I pass the facets plus the facets div, which will create that list on the search results page. After that's done, I get the body div and the results div. Then I apply some styling to the results div to push it to the right-hand side. And the results container, I add the facets div and the results div, and I add the results div to the body. And that's when you see that column on the left-hand side of the search results displayed dynamically, and this is the code that's being executed. So the final point on my list was to add support for filter queries. So each constraint for a facet is a link. And when you select that link, it executes the original search term plus a filter query. So if you select multiple constraints, it will apply multiple filter queries to that search. It follows the same flow of execution as facets, and it also adds the filter queries to the Solr request URL. So in the Solr query HTTP client, there's a block of code that will get the filter queries from the search parameters object, and if they're present, we'll iterate over them. I needed to escape some of the characters because the Lucene query parser would complain otherwise, so this is what all of this replaces. And then I append the filter query, which is the FQ query in orange, and I apply that to the URL. So when you do another search with the original search term, it filters down the results as you saw in the demo. So that's the functionality and how I got it all working. I just want to talk about some of the module plans. The code was, well, the module was originally called Ixus Solr. It's been contributed back to Alfresco, and I think there's plans to release it in Alfresco Enterprise 4.2, which is next year. There may be another community release before then, so you'll be able to have a look at it and see the code. But there's still, this was the first, what I've showed you today is just the first version, so there's still a to-do list. And there are a number of things that still need to do. There's number range faceting, which I haven't implemented. Multi-field faceting, so Alfresco has multi-fields, but that's not supported. And also hierarchical faceting. So if you felt like you wanted to contribute to this module, it would be great if we could get some community contribution. And these are a few things that could be done. So some additional information. The search term Dashlet also uses Faceting in Alfresco 4, and that code is available at the moment, and you can download the code from this repository, the Ixus repository here. And if you have a look through the source, you'll see that some of the examples I've showed you today are also in that source code. I also have a blog on the Ixus site that shows that just walks through the demonstration that I showed you today. So just to summarize, we now have a quick and easy way to add facet fields to Alfresco. It supports field facets and date facets, and there's also support for filter queries to allow you to filter the results. So any questions? No?
Would it be possible that you can add the categories facets, category facets?
I'm sorry? Category? Yeah, that would be a suitable candidate for facets, and I'm sure that would be possible. But yeah, that's another thing that could be on the to-do list.
So the code for this could be, is it something you can find it?
It's not released just yet, no. It's planned for release in Alfresco Enterprise 4.2, so that's next year. But there might be a community release before then. Sorry.
We've been struggling with the fact that Alfresco by default always uses an OR operation between search terms, and I mean, what you're doing here is really AND. I mean, of course, each facet is ANDed to your search result. Do you know of any way how you can change this default behavior? Because the user assumes it's like Google. The more you enter, the less you get, basically. So
yeah. At the moment I don't, but I could probably. I'll have a look and I'll get back to you, see if I can know anything about that. I don't at the moment, off the top of my head. No.
Thank you.
Is there any support for the open text, the open search web scripts to allow like faceting to be included as part of the open search results as well?
Not at the moment. No. Did you have a question?
Yeah, I didn't understand fully. I understand that all this code is not yet in Alfresco Enterprise.
Yeah.
So good for that. I did not catch if the faceted search is already in the Alfresco community that has just been released, or for the next.
No, it might be released in the next community release.
Thank you.
But if you have a look at this search terms dashlet, there is a facet implementation in there, and some of the things that I talked about today.
We'll have a look.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Do you have you tried it with multi-tenancy?
No, I haven't. As I said, this is the first version, so there's still many things that need to be done and tested. Okay. Any more? Thank you very much.